Here's something curious. Watch a 3-year-old for an hour. They ask why about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why does water make things wet? They're not studying. They're not preparing for a test. They're just interested. They want to know how things work. Now watch an adult trying to learn something new. Maybe they're reading a textbook, or watching an educational video, or sitting in a training session. Notice something? Often there's this look, a kind of tension. The jaw is set. The focus is intense, but not in a joyful way. It's the focus of someone doing something difficult, something they have to get through. What happened between age 3 and age 30? Because here's the thing. The human brain is actually built for learning. It's what it does best. Every moment it's taking in information, making connections, building patterns. You learn to recognize your mother's face. You learned language, one of the most complex systems humans have ever created, before you could even tie your shoes. You figured out how to walk, which requires calculating thousands of tiny muscle movements and balance adjustments, and you did it without a manual. So if learning is natural, if it's something the brain does automatically, why does it feel so hard? Why do so many people say they hate learning? The answer is simple. They don't hate learning. They hate something else that's been disguised as learning. Think about what happens when you're genuinely curious about something. Let's say you're trying to figure out why your car is making a strange noise. You're not following a curriculum. You're not memorizing facts. You're investigating. You listen carefully to the sound. You think about what parts of the car could create that noise. Maybe you look under the hood. You might ask someone who knows about engines. You might read something online. But notice, you're pulling information toward yourself. You have a question and you want an answer. This is learning in its natural form. It starts with curiosity, with not knowing something and wanting to know it. The wanting part is crucial. The brain is designed to find satisfaction in figuring things out. There's actually a small chemical reward every time you make a connection, every time something clicks into place. It's the same system that makes puzzles satisfying to solve, that makes mysteries compelling to read. But now think about typical education. Someone else decides what you should learn. They decide when you should learn it. They break it down into pieces and give you piece number 1, whether you're curious about it or not. Then they test you to see if you retain piece number 1 before moving you to piece number 2. The sequence is fixed. The pace is fixed. The material is fixed. And here's what's crucial. The questions aren't yours. When you learn something because someone told you that you need to know it, something fundamental changes. The brain's natural curiosity mechanism isn't engaged. Instead, you're using a different system, the one related to obligation, to avoiding negative consequences, to doing what you're supposed to do. This system works to some extent. People can force themselves to memorize things, to study things they don't care about. But it's effortful, it's draining, and the information doesn't stick the same way. There's a simple test for this. Think back to school. Now, try to remember the quadratic formula, or the date of some historical treaty you had to memorize, or the definition of mitosis versus meiosis. For most people, this information is gone. Not because their memory is bad, but because they never really learned it. They temporarily stored it just long enough to pass a test, and then the brain quite sensibly threw it away. Why would it keep information that has no connection to anything, that answers no question you actually have? Now think about something you learned because you wanted to know it. Maybe it's how to play a song on an instrument, or the rules of a game you enjoy, or how to cook a specific dish, or the details of a historical event you found fascinating. That information is still there, isn't it? Even years later. Because when you learned it, you were actually learning, not just storing facts temporarily. The difference isn't in the subject matter. It's in the relationship between the person and the information. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine you're hungry, and someone makes you food you actually want to eat. Maybe it's your favorite dish. You eat it, you enjoy it, your body processes it, and you're nourished. Now imagine someone forces you to eat something you find disgusting. You might be able to choke it down, but it's unpleasant, and your body might even reject it. Same basic process, eating, but completely different experiences. Learning works the same way. When the brain wants information, when there's genuine curiosity, it absorbs that information easily. The neural pathways are ready. There's attention, not forced attention, but natural attention, the kind that happens when you're interested. When the brain doesn't want the information, when it's being forced in, everything is harder. Attention drifts, retention is poor, understanding is shallow. So what makes the difference? What creates genuine curiosity? The answer is surprisingly simple. Questions. Real learning starts with a question. Not a question someone else asked you, but a question you actually have. Why does that work that way? What would happen if? How does this connect to that? The question creates a kind of tension in the mind. You know there's an answer, and you want to resolve the tension by finding it. This is why children learn so effortlessly. They're full of questions. Everything is new, so everything prompts a why or a how. They haven't learned to suppress their curiosity yet. They haven't learned that asking questions might make them look stupid, or that some questions aren't worth asking, or that they should just memorize what they're told. Adults still have this capacity. It's not gone, but it gets buried under years of being told what to learn and how to learn it. Many people have been trained quite thoroughly to see learning as something that happens to them, not something they do for themselves. Watch what happens when an adult becomes genuinely interested in something. Maybe they decide they want to learn how to bake bread. Suddenly, they're researching flour types, understanding gluten development, experimenting with hydration ratios. They're watching videos, reading articles, trying things out. They might spend hours on this, and they don't experience it as studying. It's just interesting. They have questions, and they're finding answers. Or consider someone who gets interested in how something went wrong. A bridge collapsed, or a company failed, or a historical event unfolded in an unexpected way. If they're genuinely curious, they'll dig into it. They'll want to understand the mechanism, the chain of causes and effects. And in the process, they'll learn all sorts of things, engineering principles, economic factors, human psychology, without it feeling like work. The subject doesn't matter. What matters is whether there's a real question driving the learning. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You can actually cultivate this. You can learn how to learn in a way that's natural and enjoyable. It's not complicated, but it requires a shift in how you approach new information. First, start with what you're actually curious about, not with what you think you should learn. If you're interested in why certain movies are scary, that's a legitimate starting point. You might end up learning about psychology, about visual composition, about sound design, about pacing and narrative structure. All of that is real knowledge, but you got there through genuine interest, not through obligation. Second, follow your questions, not someone else's curriculum. Let's say you're curious about how airplanes fly. You might start with a simple explanation, but then you might wonder, what exactly is lift? That leads you to air pressure. Then maybe you wonder why air pressure works that way, which leads you to molecular motion. Or maybe you get curious about why wings are shaped the way they are, which leads you to fluid dynamics. Each answer creates new questions. This is natural. This is how understanding deepens. The traditional approach would be, here's chapter 1 on basic aerodynamics. Memorize these terms, take a quiz, then move to chapter 2. But that's backward. It starts with answers and hopes you'll develop questions. Natural learning starts with questions and pulls in answers. Third, use your own understanding, not memorization. When you're trying to learn something, the goal isn't to be able to repeat information. It's to understand it well enough that you could explain it in your own words, using your own analogies. If you can't do that, you don't really understand it yet, you've just memorized some words. This is actually a powerful test. Take any concept you think you understand and try to explain it to someone who knows nothing about it without using any jargon. If you can do that, you understand it. If you can't, you've identified where your understanding is shallow. That's not a failure, that's useful information. Now you know what question to ask next. Fourth, make connections. The brain doesn't store information in isolation. It stores it as part of a network. Every piece of information connects to other pieces. When you learn something new, actively think about how it relates to things you already know. Does it explain something you've observed? Does it contradict something you thought was true? Does it work the same way as something in a completely different domain? These connections are what make information stick. They're also what make learning enjoyable. There's real satisfaction in seeing how things fit together and having those aha moments when you realize two different concepts are actually related. Fifth, accept confusion as part of the process. When you're genuinely learning something, there's always a period of not understanding. This is normal. It's not a sign that you're bad at learning or that the subject is too hard. It's just what happens when you encounter something new. The brain needs time to build the right mental structures. The problem is that traditional education punishes confusion. If you don't understand something quickly, you fall behind, you get poor grades, you feel stupid. So people learn to avoid confusion, to stick to things they already know, to never venture into genuine uncertainty. But real learning requires being comfortable with temporary confusion. It's the space between not knowing and knowing. You can't skip it. Here's what's fascinating. When you approach learning this way, starting with curiosity, following your questions, seeking understanding rather than memorization, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like play, like solving a puzzle, like exploring. And the information sticks, not because you drilled it into your memory, but because you understand it. Understanding is its own kind of memory. You don't have to remember Newton's third law. If you actually understand the principle, you can recreate it because it makes sense. This is why children learn so much so quickly. They're not studying. They're playing. They're experimenting. They're asking questions and finding answers, and they're doing it all day, every day, without it being exhausting, because their curiosity is engaged. The tragedy is that the educational system often trains this out of people. By the time someone is an adult, they might believe that learning is supposed to be hard, that it requires discipline and willpower, that some people are just good at learning and others aren't. But that's like saying some people are good at being hungry and others aren't. Everyone's brain wants to learn. That's what it does. The question is whether you're feeding it questions it actually wants answers to, or trying to force feed it information it has no use for. Think about the last time you fell down a rabbit hole online. You started looking up one thing, and 3 hours later you're reading about something completely different, having followed a chain of interesting connections. That's learning. Effortless, enjoyable learning. You weren't forcing yourself to pay attention. Attention happened naturally because you were curious. Now imagine if someone had handed you a textbook covering all those topics and told you to study it for a test. Same information, but completely different experience. The mechanism here is worth understanding. The human brain has limited resources for forced attention, for making yourself focus on something you're not interested in. This is willpower, and it depletes. After a few hours of forced study, you're exhausted. But curiosity-driven attention is different. It doesn't deplete the same way. You can follow your curiosity for hours and feel energized rather than drained. This has enormous implications. It means that the traditional approach to learning, forcing yourself through material you're not interested in, is not just unpleasant, it's inefficient. You're using the wrong mental mechanism. It's like trying to move a heavy object by pushing it uphill instead of rolling it downhill. Here's a useful thought experiment. Imagine you could learn anything you wanted, but you couldn't get a degree in it, it wouldn't help your career, and no one would ever test you on it. What would you choose to learn? Most people have immediate answers to this question. Oh, I'd love to understand quantum mechanics. I'd learn to play piano. I'd study the history of ancient Rome. I'd figure out how the brain works. There are all these things people are genuinely curious about, but they don't pursue them because they seem impractical, or because learning has become associated with obligation rather than curiosity. But here's the thing. The mechanism of learning is the same whether you're learning something practical or not. If you can reawaken that natural curiosity, if you can make learning feel like following your interests rather than fulfilling obligations, you'll learn practical things better too. Let's say you need to learn statistics for work. The traditional approach, get a textbook, start at chapter 1, force yourself through it. The curiosity approach, start with a question you actually have. Maybe you want to understand why polls are sometimes wrong, or how doctors determine if a treatment works, or what people mean when they say a result is statistically significant. Start there. Follow your genuine curiosity. You'll end up learning the statistics you need, but you'll understand it better because you pulled it in rather than having it pushed on you. This works for anything. You want to learn a language? Don't start with grammar drills. Start with something you're actually interested in, maybe a movie, or music, or articles about a topic you care about. You'll be confused at first, but you'll be motivated to figure out what's being said. Grammar will make sense because you have a context for it, a reason to care about the difference between this verb tense and that one. The principle is universal. Start with a real question, with genuine curiosity, and let that pull you into the learning. Now, there's an objection that comes up here. What about things you need to know but aren't naturally curious about? What about requirements, prerequisites, things you have to learn whether you're interested or not? This is a real issue, but it's often overstated. First, there's usually a way to connect required knowledge to something you are curious about. If you need to learn calculus, maybe you're not interested in derivatives as abstract concepts, but you might be interested in how things change over time, how a population grows, how a rocket accelerates, how medicine spreads through the body. Find that connection, and suddenly calculus is the tool that helps you understand something you care about. Second, even when you can't find that connection, understanding how learning actually works is useful. You can at least avoid the most inefficient approaches. Don't just read and reread the same information. Don't highlight endlessly. Don't copy notes you don't understand. Instead, test yourself. Try to explain it. Find what confuses you and focus there. Even if you're not naturally curious about the material, you can use techniques that work with your brain rather than against it. But third, and most important, most learning in life is optional. People don't realize this. After formal education ends, you get to choose what you learn. And even during formal education, there's enormous room for following your own interests within and beyond the curriculum. The real issue is that many people have learned to suppress their curiosity so thoroughly that they don't even know what they're interested in anymore. They've learned to think of learning as a chore, as something done for external reasons, to get a grade, to get a job, to meet a requirement. But curiosity is still there. It's waiting. Ask someone about a topic they find fascinating and watch what happens. Their whole demeanor changes. They lean forward. They speak faster. Their eyes light up. They want to share what they understand, to explore what they don't yet understand. That's the natural state. That's what learning looks like when it's working right. So if learning feels like pulling teeth, if it's exhausting and unrewarding, that's not a sign that you're bad at learning. It's a sign that you're approaching it wrong. You're trying to force feed yourself information your brain has no particular reason to want. The solution isn't to try harder with the same approach. It's to change the approach, to start with questions you actually have, to follow your genuine curiosity, to learn because you want to understand, not because you're supposed to know. When you do this, learning transforms. It becomes something you look forward to rather than something you have to make yourself do. Understanding becomes its own reward. The process becomes enjoyable. And here's the beautiful irony. When learning becomes enjoyable, when you're following genuine curiosity, you actually learn more. You understand more deeply. You retain information better. You make more connections. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're working with your brain's natural mechanisms rather than against them. The 3-year-old asking why about everything isn't working hard at learning. They're just curious. And in a few short years, driven purely by that curiosity, they'll master language, develop sophisticated reasoning, build complex models of how the world works, all without textbooks, without tests, without anyone making them study. That capacity doesn't go away as you get older. It just gets buried under expectations, under obligations, under the accumulated weight of years of being told what to learn and how to learn it. But it's still there, still waiting, still ready to make learning what it should be. Not a chore, not an obligation, but a natural expression of the simple fact that the human brain wants to understand the world. The question isn't whether you can enjoy learning. The question is whether you're willing to learn the way your brain actually wants to learn, starting with curiosity, following questions, seeking understanding, rather than the way you were taught that learning is supposed to happen. If you're not enjoying learning, you're not doing it wrong because you lack discipline or intelligence. You're doing it wrong because you're using the wrong mechanism. You're trying to force something that works better when you let it flow naturally. The solution is simpler than you think. Find something you're genuinely curious about. Start there. Follow the questions that emerge. Let understanding build naturally. And notice how different it feels when learning is something you want to do rather than something you have to do. That's not a trick or a technique. That's just learning the way it's meant to work.